You're gonna want to see this.
There's a detective flying in from Chicago today.
Jews and Catholics are the ravenous wolves.
Marie's torso was the only one we ever found.
It starts with Abigail leaving the synagogue to go home at night. Once inside, she hears a knock and opens the door, assuming it is a delivery. However, the killer slams her in and closes all windows before he starts to get his tools prepared. The Chicago police arrive at a crime scene to investigate, and Dan Lawson is there too. He then starts to explain that the killing is between gang members, and he leaves to have a drink at a bar. His partner tries to get him to quit drinking. Dan sits in his car, drinking, and an undercover cop knocks on his window, asking to let him in. He then shows him a killing case and briefs about a serial killer who's been laying low for 6 years. Dan agrees to be involved in the case, and the cop tells him the crime happened in Scotland.
Kills 5 seemingly random people in Chicago.
In Edinburgh, Detective Glenn Boyes is ready to leave work as his wife Marie reminds him to come home early, mentioning she needs him that night. He explains that Dan will be flying in and that he must show him the crime scene. At the office, Glenn is introduced to Dan by his boss, Cassel. She takes them both and explains about Abigail's killing by referring to a case file from Dan's department. She shows pictures of the victim and the symbols they have found. Dan asks about their progress on the investigation and learns that there's one person they have suspected, a man named Avery who argued with Abigail.
Mr. Avery Thompson. Reports of an argument, but we haven't verified it yet.
On their way to the crime scene, Dan asks Glenn about his family. Glenn tells him about his son, Callum, who died about a year ago, and that today would have been his 3rd birthday. At Abigail's house, Glenn explains what the police have found, with a key left behind. Dan sighs and tells him this killer is not the same as the one he has on the case in Chicago. Soon, Maria calls Glenn, and Dan watches through the window as he speaks with her outside.
Still with him? The American. I just got away.
Glenn sees as Avery gets to his house, and he follows him. He knocks on his door and tries to make him talk, but fails. He then goes to his neighbor, Elizabeth, to investigate more. She invites him in and tells him Avery was mad at Abigail, and they had a fight, accusing her of throwing eggs at his car. That night, Glenn returns home and finds Marie sad, as Dan, on the other hand, sits in his room, sipping his drink and thinking of Sarah. The killer, however, goes to a girl named Grace's house and continues with his ritual. Dan and Glenn meet up to head to Avery's house at night. After arriving, Dan spots Avery escaping and informs Glenn before he follows him with his car. Glenn catches Avery, who explains that he has had a perfect alibi on the day Abigail was killed, and the reason he runs is because he assumed they were men to whom he owed some money.
Check that! 7:30 p.m.
Glenn gets home late at night and goes to bed. Maria asks if he wants to talk about his case, but he tells her they better sleep. The next morning, Maria suggests that they invite Dan for dinner before Cassel calls Glenn to inform him about Grace's murder. He arrives at the scene, and soon Dan joins. They find a blood footprint the killer left behind, and Glenn continues to search the house for more evidence. After finding an ankh on the wall, he decides to go to Abigail's house to investigate more. Arriving there, Dan finds a hint and a verse from the Bible which give them a clue that the killer is going after Jews and Catholics.
Beware false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing.
At the station, Glenn questions Grace's mother, asking who might want to hurt her daughter. He learns about her ex-boyfriend, Colin McGregor, and that their relationship ended abruptly. Dan meets his old friend, Walker, who worked with him for 18 years. Walker and he talked for a while about the past and the choices they had made. Dan learns that he designs alarm systems, and he shares his story about still thinking of Sarah.
I can't stop thinking about Sarah.
Glenn goes to Colin and tells him about Grace's death. Glenn asks questions, but Colin refuses to answer, saying he needs a lawyer present before he says anything. Taking him to the station, Glenn continues with his interrogation. He asks about Grace, and Colin denies what he's being accused of. Walker goes to a bar with Dan and Glenn to discuss symbols and religions. Dan believes the killer must think he's realizing her from this life and ushering her to the next. On the other hand, Colin is in front of Marie's window, looking at her and pleasing himself. The next morning, Glenn goes to Kildalton Church Hall, and he's stopped by one of the members who thought he was a journalist. He starts to ask about Colin, who was one of them, but got dismissed because he could not adhere to his beliefs. A man, who looks like their leader, shows up and takes Glenn with him. He explains their gathering has a call and that they're not cults. He informs them that they know about their murder investigation and that Colin is not one of theirs now since he didn't comply. Even though the cross may look alike, he assures him they don't kill.
I think you should go, unless you really want to test my theory about sheep.
Glenn and Maria invite Dan and Walker for dinner, and they have a pleasant conversation. Marie leaves for the kitchen to get more wine, and Walker follows her. Inside, they talk and laugh alone until they go out, and Dan notices them. Maria sees, and they return to the table, where Dan starts a conversation about grief and their son, Callum. Maria, certain that he's talking about her and mocking her for cheating, gets defensive. After they leave, she asks Glenn if he's told Dan about Callum and her affair. She tells him she misses Callum and that she misses him before she asks if they could try again. The next morning, Maria wakes up smiling, and Glenn asks why. She brings up an idea to go to Italy for a trip when he finishes the case and catches the killer. He happily agrees. At the station, Elizabeth comes once more to give out information. She tells them she saw a man on the street holding a delivery box and calls out the man to be Colin. Cassel gives them permission, reminding them it won't be easy to arrest him. Glenn arrives at the place with his team, and they spot Colin sneaking around. When he opens the door to get in, the team arrives, and he runs away. Glenn chases him on foot, using a guide from the drone operators.
Continue north on Burton Road.
After catching him, they start to fight, and Colin begins to run once more. However, Glenn fires his gun, and Colin gives up. They take him to the station, and Glenn goes home. Arriving home, he calls out to Marie, but gets no answer. When he calls her phone, it leads him to a roof, where he finds her dead and cut into pieces. Soon, the police arrive and surround the house as Glenn sits by the doorsteps, full of sadness. He leaves the house and gets a hotel room, where he sits and sees his family photo while weeping. After a while, Walker invites Glenn to meet up. After they meet, he urges him to continue with the case and never stop for whatever reason. He urges him to tell him how close they are to catching the killer, but gets interrupted by a phone call from Cassel discussing finding Maria's torso. He abruptly leaves and drives to the bridge. His team members and bosses try to stop him from seeing what they found, but he runs past them, asking if it is indeed Marie's torso. He sees the body down the river. And Walker gets on his side, telling him to focus and stay in control. At the station, Cassel is interrogating Colin, asking what he was doing at Abigail's house, but his lawyer defends him, saying it was coincidental. Colin confesses to meeting a foreigner while returning from a convention. The foreigner ranted about unsolved murders of women and talked about the same scenario as the murder pictures. Glenn suddenly barges in and accuses Colin of killing those women. Dan takes him out of the room and continues the questioning with Cassel. He asks about his religion and some questions which left Colin staring. Dan and Glenn meet up at a bar, and Glenn is scared Cassel will take him off the case. Dan advises him to be calm and keep his interests aside to keep working on the case. He tells him his girlfriend Sarah was killed the same way, and only Walker knew they were dating.
It's McGregor. I know it is.
Every lead gets back to him.
The next day at work, Dan asks Glenn if he's told anyone about Maria's affair, but learns he didn't. They meet with Walker, who asks what Colin has confessed about the foreigner. They tell him he hates religion, and he's calculated. Walker learns Colin is at a bar drinking. He thinks there's something more to the case, and suggests they check Colin's place with the key found at Abigail's. In the meantime, Colin is at a bar, and he leaves through the back door after being asked to pay for his drinks. He stops by his car to take a leak, but the killer arrives and kills him on the spot. The next day, Glenn goes to check the key and finds out it opens one of the sheds of Colin's. He calls for backup and goes inside the house to check. After finding a huge bloodstain on the rug, he returns to the shed. Once inside, he sees Collins' body parts slammed to the wall, posing as a cross. Dan and his team arrive and learns the killer has killed Colin because he was ruining his master's work by posing as him. They get called to the house and find a list of people that he had planned to kill from different faiths.
Why is there no photos of Marie?
You didn't kill Marie.
Dan explains he is cleansing them of what he considers false religion. Marie's photo wasn't on the list, and Dan tells him Colin didn't kill Marie, and her kill was the same as the US killer. Dan is in his room, and he finds a picture of Colin and Walker together. He calls Walker to tell him about Collins' death, and Walker decides to go to his place after learning Dan's alone. Dan also sends the picture for Glenn, and he rules out that Walker is the killer. He informs Kessler that Dan is in danger as he heads out to his hotel. Walker is confronted by Dan if he knows Colin, but he claims he doesn't remember him. Glenn starts to call Dan, and he informs him that Walker is the foreigner.
Lawson!
But Dan hangs up casually. Dan brings out a jewelry box that contains possessions of the murdered women, one being Sarah's necklace. He reminds Walker that he gave it to her, and he yells for stealing her from him after pulling out a gun. He confesses about his killings, including the people who played a part in Walker and Sarah's relationship, like a receptionist, the girl who sold the necklace, the waiter, and the florist. Dan explains that he wanted to prolong Walker's suffering that way. Soon, they start to fight, and Walker gets shot in the stomach just when Glenn arrives. Dan insists that Glenn shoots him, but Walker mumbles about being in love, and Glenn stops. Dan quietly leaves the room, and Glenn goes through his stuff, finding Dan's passport with another name. Glenn immediately calls Dan and asks him to come up, but Dan drives off. Glenn begins to follow him with his car, and Dan stops in the forest and shoots at him. After being conscious, Glenn searches for him, and they start shooting at each other as Glenn blames him for killing Marie. However, Dan retreats, saying he did it to set him free from her. Soon, Dan comes behind him and takes away his gun and shoots at his phone. Glenn tells him to run today, but tomorrow he'll hunt him down. Dan leaves nonetheless. It ends as Glenn waits to arrest Dan with all his security set up, and waits until the suspect leaves the car. Soon, they see the man in the car is not Dan. Kessler tells Glenn the case is now an international one, and they have to hand it over. Glenn is angry with the decision, and still is determined to bring Dan to justice. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.